As you can see, I've finished doing all of the quilting in both colors, and I've also added a little line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, not too far out because I don't want it to show once we start adding the binding. The next step is to add the small piece of binding along the bottom of the pocket. As you can see, I've got the open edges of the binding here, and I'm going to stitch those down. I'll show you how. I've already done it on this pocket. I just put the open edges along the edge here, stitched it straight down. Now I'm going to fold this over to the back of the pocket, hold it in place, and slip stitch it with just a little hand stitch to keep it in place. Once I get both of these stitched on and hand stitched down on the back, we can start putting the whole potholder together using the exterior binding. Hi. As you can see, I've finished adding the binding to the edges of each pocket by hand stitching it down to the back. I've also added a line of zigzag stitching down the middle of the little piece of double folded fabric that we're using for the loop. That's being held in place with just a little bit of Elmer's glue that I've set with an iron. The Elmer's glue will wash away later on, but it keeps it in place temporarily. Now, we're going to finish adding the binding to the front before we stitch it down. As you can see, I'm just easing this binding along these curved edges, which is not hard to do because we use that nice, flexible bias binding. I'm holding them in place using the binder clips, although you can also use straight-edged pins if you don't have any of the binder clips. Make sure that you stop a good 3 to 4 inches away from where you started stitching the binding down here, because you need room to be able to add the pieces together. So let's stitch this down and then I'll show you how to close up the opening, and we're nearly done. As you can see, I stitched all the way around the edge of my potholder using my walking foot again and back stitching where I started and stopped. You might notice there are a couple of other areas where I back stitched as well. For example, here it's quite thick, and even with my walking foot, my stitches originally weren't very good. So I just ripped out a little portion, backstitched, and kept on going. If that happens to you, don't worry about it. Okay, now we just need to close off this gap. To do that, we need to trim this top one. This one is already trimmed, and we want this top one to extend 2¼ inches over the one below. That's because the width of this bias binding is 2¼ so the amount they should extend is 2¼ I'm just cutting the top one again so that they cover each other by 2¼ inches. As you can see, we've trimmed and we have the correct amount of overlap, 2¼ but the edge of the binding was just a little bit too close to the stitching on this end. So make sure you put your overlap more in the gap. To fix this problem for now, I've just undone a few of those stitches and backstitched over them so they'll stay in place. Now we're going to sew these two ends together. To do that, first we want to get rid of some of this bulk and give us a little bit more room to work. I'm going to put a clip here, and then we can get to these overlaps, get these to overlap more easily. We want to put them together, right sides together, and we want them to be perpendicular to one another. So this one is going to be horizontal, this one is going to be vertical. As you can see, they're perpendicular to one another. We're going to take this over to the machine and we're going to sew a row of stitches along the diagonal there. As you can see, I've managed to stitch a line across this diagonal, back stitching at the beginning and the end to hold it in place. You also notice that it's slightly askew because this is always a really tricky bit of binding, but don't worry about that because it'll be okay in the end. Okay, we're going to trim this out about 1/4 inch away from the seam line, leaving 1/4 inch of fabric. There you go. So we're going to take this over to the iron. I'll finger press it for now, but we'll take it over to the iron and press it open. That will reduce the bulk in our binding. And then our binding will be finished and ready to stitch down. As you can see, I've stitched this last bit of bias binding into place. Now remember, The great thing about bias binding is that it's so stretchy and will ease nicely over the curves. The bad thing about bias binding is also that it's so stretchy, so when you're trying to ease this last bit into place where it's a little bit tight, it may stretch out a bit and you may have some extra fabric to work in there when you're stitching it down. Don't worry about that, because once you tuck this and turn it over and finish off, you'll hardly notice it, if at all. Now, the last thing to do, like I said, is tucking and turning it over nicely. And you just need to stitch it down into place in whatever method you prefer. If you're like me, I like to do it by hand, but you could also do it by machine. This is a nice generous binding, and there's plenty of room here to stitch around the edge, and it'll just show up like some extra quilting lines on the front, assuming you use a similar color thread to your quilting threads. Whatever method you choose, make sure you stitch down here first with the loop hanging down, and then push the loop up and put a few extra stitches on top of here as well. That way the loop will be nicely in place and ready to hang your pot holder. It's been great fun welcoming you into my sewing studio today and teaching you how to make this cute little pot holder. Make sure you go to the Sew Mama Sew website, where you can print off the full list of materials we've used and the PDF templates that you need to make your own project. And if you do make your own project, I would love to see it. Post it on Instagram and tag me at Olivia Marie Create so I can see what you made. Why don't you also check out our website? If there's anything you see in the gallery that you'd like a tutorial for, drop me a line using the contact details on the website. In the meantime, thanks for watching.